Welcome to our series on anti-racism and equity momentum in America. My name is Maria Madison, and I'm the Associate Dean for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity at the Heller School. I'm your host today, and our goal is to understand the state of Black America, especially at this pivotal moment, the summer of 2020, with pandemics and protests and Black Lives Matter movement. We want to understand it from a multidisciplinary approach. We've seen it from the perspective of artists, including one of our panelists' daughter, Bill Rodgers' daughter. We've seen it and heard it from the perspective of music, from the perspective of a video capturing a real live event in 1975. And now we're going to turn to our scholars, our multidisciplinary scholars, to get an insight into the state of Black America from the perspective of an economist, an historian, and a legal scholar. We hope we all leave not just wiser, but with specific action items. I'd like to introduce our panelists, which include Professor Leah Wright Rigueur. She's the author of an award-winning study, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics, and the Pursuit of Power. Her new book, Morning in America, Black Men and Women in a White House, documents critical transformations in American politics in the 1980s through an exploration of political scandal and corruption, as told through two contrasting perspectives, that of Black women, public housing activists, and of Black officials in the Ronald Reagan-helmed White House. She holds a PhD in history from Princeton University and a BA in history from Dartmouth College, one of our newest colleagues here in the Brandeis African and African American Studies AAAS department. William Rodgers III is Professor of Public Policy and Chief Economist at the Heldrich Center for Workforce Development at Rutgers University. He's a member of the graduate faculty of Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations and a senior research affiliate of the National Poverty Center at the University of Michigan. He's also served as the chief economist at the US Department of Labor and was a member of President Obama's Department of Labor transition team. His research focuses on the income of minority and disadvantaged workers and the state of Black America. He's the author of an award-winning book on the economics of discrimination. Professor Anita Hill has famously stated, "I resent the idea that people would blame the messenger for the message, rather than looking at the content of the message itself." Professor Hill is a lawyer, an advocate, a mentor to many, and an academic. She holds the rank of University Professor at Brandeis in Social Policy, Law, and Women's Studies, and is a faculty member here at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. In her second book, Reimagining Equality, Stories of Gender, Race, and Finding Home, she discusses the relationship between home and the American dream. She also exposes the inequalities within gender and race and home ownership. She argues that inclusive democracy is more important than debates about legal rights. She uses her own history and history of other African Americans in order to strengthen her argument for reimagining equality together. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed colleagues and scholars. My first two questions are, what is the state of Black America and how did we get here? We're going to have our presenters discuss that in alphabetical order, beginning with Professor Hill, then Professor Rodgers, and then Professors Wright Rigueur. We've asked our scholars to keep their answers to within 4 to 6 minutes each to ensure we have time to engage in conversation with each of you in the audience. With that, Professor Hill, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Dr. Madison, and thank you for thank you for convening this gathering. It not only, I'm hopeful that it will really bring new knowledge and awareness to our listeners, but I know for me it is personally rewarding and affirming, and especially at this time. I really feel like my state is a reflection of the state of Black America today. We're looking for answers. We're looking to people like my fellow panelists here and our guests to help us really understand where we are and how we got here. I do want to, before I start, to talk about Black America, because I do think there is a parallel. I want to just say that my heart is going out to the indigenous people of Brazil today. They have had their land encroached upon. They are now surrounded by industry. And like Black and Brown Americans, they have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 in ways that has the potential to eliminate many, maybe much of their population. So with that, I would say the state of Black America is, in fact, at a point now where we have seen the kinds of encroachments on our community, not necessarily in physically, but certainly politically and economically. The limitations that have been put on us have been severe and long-lasting, intergenerational. And at this particular moment politically, we are in a state of chaos and political leadership that is guided by egotism and not policy or what is in the best interest of our democracy. When I think about where we are and how we got here from the point of view of law, of course, I think about the deaths, the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. I think about the deaths and what amounts to the killings of Black and Brown people because they were not considered in terms of public policy, and the needs of those communities were not considered in terms of making policy, health policy, to stop the virus. But I also think about the election of 2016 and how that election really unleashed much of the neglect of our communities and made, in some ways, it acceptable by bringing in to office an individual who had shown no concern for communities of color and continues to show that lack of concern. Specifically as a lawyer, I mean, I'm going back to the phrase Fannie Lou Hamer. And I can remember watching Fannie Lou Hamer on television. And what she was talking about really was being able to vote and having those rights, her rights in Mississippi to be a part of the democratic process, having it protected. And so from that, we ultimately have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But in 2013, in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which began to protect the rights of African Americans and other populations, other communities, including Native populations, right to vote. That act was gutted by a Supreme Court holding in the Shelby County case that basically did away with something that was really the backbone of the Voting Rights Act. And that was the requirement that states and localities pre-clear provisions that impacted the right to vote, pre-clear those provisions before they could be put in place. Without the pre-clearance, what has happened is that individuals, communities, individual localities, individual states, and I can name them like Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, were putting into place provisions that were basically voter suppression. So that is what's been happening since 2013. And later on, when we talk about this, I want I'll say a little bit more about the specific provisions and what we need to do to move forward. But the Shelby County case really did unleash a whole era of voter suppression in this country that has been unleashed by the Supreme Court and is now being constantly challenged in the Supreme Court with some success, but not entire. I would just close here by saying that where we are also is at a moment of really looking at just about everything in terms of race. And one of the things that we're looking at is the rhetoric that we use. I was talking to a group the other day and I jokingly said, I grew up in Oklahoma, which is, most people don't think of it as the South, but it's really pretty much the near South. And it was populated by Southerners. And when Oklahoma became a state, one of the first acts was to put into place segregation, legalize segregation. But I have never heard in my life so many people use the term anti-racist. And what I believe is that what follows then is our thinking. That if we use the language, and Black Lives Matter has done a wonderful job of bringing that language to us, and also scholars who work on anti-racism as well, but to make that part of the public conversation. I've never heard so many white people talk about racism in my entire life. And I think it's important for all of us to think about the rhetoric that we use. And so in my work, what I have started to think about is the term systemic racism. And I've sort of switched that term in my head to systematized racism, to really reflect that racism is being built into our system. It's not something that's automatic. It's not something that's static. It's something that is being recreated over and over in our system, rebuilt into our system. And that's why the Shelby County case was so important, because it allowed racism to once again be built into our voting system. And so when we think about that, I think if we think about the election that's coming up, we're in a time of uncertainty. How do we think about the factors that created systemic racism? How is it created? I think only when we do that can we think about how to undo those things. And finally, only when we think about how racism is systematized will we be able to think about how we systematize an anti-racist policy. So I'll leave it at that, and I have more to say later about what I think those ideas are and where we can go with them.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you particularly for drawing our attention to and reminding us as well of the plight of Indigenous, the Indigenous population, especially at a time where I think it's the Supreme Court as well, just allowed for access, is it Oklahoma, land rights, which is balanced against the continued struggle. So one step forward and still 30 steps back. Thank you as well for particularly drawing our attention to a transition from systemic and institutionalized racism to systematized racism. Before we make that transition, I'm finding that people are using the words often without hearing perhaps its origin or the definition. So to get to your beautiful new vision of systematized racism, I want to just read one sentence from this book, hashtag Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, which describes what systemic racism is, and that Black revolutionary Stokely Carmichael and social scientist Charles Hamilton coined the phrase institutional racism in their Black Power book. The term was prescient, anticipating the coming turn toward colorblindness and the idea that racism was only present if the intention was undeniable. Therefore, institutional racism or structural racism can be defined as the policies, programs, and practices of public and private institutions that result in greater rates of poverty, dispossession, and criminalization, illness, and ultimately mortality of African Americans. So you want us to move from that base and get to an understanding of systematized racism, which propels those inequities. Thank you so much. Professor Rodgers.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Madison, and thank you all for spending the morning with us. Before I get into my formal, well, these will be formal comments too, is just to connect to the documentary that you shared with us. As I thought about that, and was watching it and thought about that, it brought me forward to a school board meeting that I attended a couple weeks ago in my township here in New Jersey. And it's a township, it's a fairly well-off township. And the session was convened by the board chair, who wanted to hear Black voices, who wanted students and members of the community to share their experiences. And what is really, really distressing, and this is not me being naive, but it's very distressing, was the commentary, the shares by many of the young people, particularly those who had graduated and they were in college, and so they were distant. They couldn't be potentially retaliated directly, but they shared over and over and over similar experiences as to what those young ladies and young men experienced in their bike ride. But the problem is and many people think, and when we start getting into solutions, that if we end segregation, if we end segregation residentially, if we end segregation in terms of school choice, or school people go to school, right, that will level the playing field. Well, it doesn't. Many of these kids kept on over and over talking about being called the N-word, talk about being called affirmative action kids. And it wasn't necessarily to their face as was in the video, but it was on social media, right? It was on social media, just pervasive, right? And it was just over and over and over, different kids at different times. And these kids, there are many of them are 18, 19, and 20. And they're already sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? They're already sick and tired of being sick and tired. And the other thing that now expanding to the conversation of sort of the economy and sort of economic wellness and well-being, and in my comment here, the punchline here is we're similar to that segment that my colleague Valerie Wilson from the Economic Policy Institute, we did a study a number of years ago looking at Black earnings, and basically the relative earnings of Black men, and I believe even women too, relative to whites, are what they were back in 1979. Okay? There was an improvement, but over this period of time, it's been largely the decline, relative decline. So, and now even if you also include, there's been another study that you also include those who've been incarcerated, or folks who've left the labor force, right, stopped searching, not working, the relative earnings of Blacks, or relative incomes of Blacks, are what they were in 1950. Okay? So if you just focus on earnings, relative economic status of Black Americans is about what it was in 1979. If you incorporate incarceration and the labor force departure of particularly men, that relative status takes you back to 1950. How did we get here? How did we get here? And let me back up too. These, as I said, these estimates, right, predate the pandemic, okay? They predate the pandemic. So if we were to probably update these, right, it's particularly the earnings differential and the unemployment rate differences, it's going to look even worse, right? But so how did we get here? Well, we've seen major changes in how our economy works. Right? How we work, the where we work, the when we work, and with whom we work has changed. And sort of three broad trends have driven those changes: globalization, technological change, and then changing population diversity. And what has happened is over that period of time, particularly the study with Valerie Wilson, yes, we saw an increase in discrimination, okay, which disadvantaged Blacks, but we also saw the growth and the role of importance of what many economists will call non-racial, race-specific causes. So globalization, right? Trade, so the export, the loss of jobs, movement of factories out of the United States, out of the Midwest in particular, or abroad, or we've seen the increased use of robots in the workplace. And some work that I did with Richard Freeman for the Century Foundation, we found that the young African-American men with the least education in the Midwest, they're the ones who've been really bearing the brunt of robots, of increased technology. So, and then there's public policy, right? So we've been having a difficult time of raising the minimum wage at the federal level. We've had a difficult time at promoting the ability for workers to collectively bargain. Hopefully that this pandemic is going to lead to a resurgence, a growth in the ability of workers to collectively bargain. But the bottom line here is that whether it be decline in unionization, failure to raise the minimum wage at the federal level, more sort of market-based types of changes such as technology or globalization, right? These have hurt all Americans, particularly all low and moderate income Americans. But because, and this is the racism part of it, right? Because these policies disadvantage, or these economic outcomes disadvantage Blacks more than others, because Blacks are in the lower part of the income scale where the effects are occurring, right? That leads to expanding or worsening in the relative and absolute status of Blacks. Last comment, we're in COVID right now. The work that many of us and others have been doing have shown that this double whammy has occurred for Blacks and Latinos, and also actually for women. And that even a lot of the evidence is coming out, and my colleague who runs the Institute for Women's Policy Research, Nicole Brown Mason, she has said, defined this as, we're in a she session. And that because of the way we cut back or close the economy in terms of jobs and occupations, they've had a more disadvantage on particularly women of color. Unemployment rates have started to fall, but they're still, particularly for young workers, well in excess of 20–25%. And that's the economic side of things. And as Dr. Hill mentioned, on the health side, right, we've also seen that Blacks and people of color are taking the hits in both dimensions. What does this mean going forward in terms of status? Well, the other big indicator that we focus on is wealth, right? Wealth differences make the racial earnings and income differences look good. And so my governor, I work on his Restart and Reopening Task Force. He's talking about wanting to have an inclusive recovery. That's the artist. Just walked by. But he talks about wanting to have an inclusive recovery, right? Where we don't have, in the next pandemic or next downturn, we don't see these disparate impacts. Well, what that's going to entail is what the United Nations calls investments in human priorities. Not along with investments in education, but also investments in social capital, the rebuilding of communities. And then the final part of this point here, right, is that the rebuilding, if we are truly wanting to move from a racist society into the systematizing of racism, right, in my view, the resources that are going to have to be delivered, right, to Blacks and to communities of color, to the indigenous populations in the United States, we can't equalize. There's going to have to be a commitment to actually provide the resources in addition to what you would view as being equalization. Am I hopeful? Always hopeful. But that means we got a lot of work to do, though. And this conversation is the beginning of that.
Thank you. In the next round, I might come back and ask you, where do those resources come from? How do we allocate them to where they're most needed? Right. Professor Wright Rigueur.
Right. So thank you so much, Maria, and thank you for organizing this panel. It's, a real privilege to sit here and talk with this audience, but also to talk with Bill and Anita, who have brought in really important points. And I'm really looking forward to the larger discussion where we can kind of bounce back and forth on these things. But I thought that I could help answer the questions by pointing out a few things. The most important of which, I think, is that despite significant reforms, especially the reforms of the 1960s, that in fact, Black project and Black progress in Black America, what we see right now is deeply fragile. So Black people continue to face marginalization and exclusion, but most importantly, I think, we are beginning to face regression. And in fact, I wouldn't even go so far as saying beginning to face, that at every step of incremental progress, we've also faced regression. And there's a reason for that. I think we tend to think of this, that saying, that very famous saying about the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice or progress, in our case, democracy. And I think we have to challenge that. We have to push back at that. And what I want to point out is that the progress, one of the things that I've done in my own research is point out that the progress of a select few, coupled with the absence of, say, visible forms of racism like the KKK, actually gives the mistaken impression that racism has ended and that Black Americans have reached full equality. But nothing could actually be further from the truth, because the ghosts and the historical consequences, discriminatory practices actually continue to live on and cause widespread harm in the present. I especially really like how Anita's idea of systematized racism, right? So continuing inequalities builds on this larger idea of, structural inequalities, institutional inequalities, but also the ghosts and consequences of historical discriminatory practices continuing to live on and causing widespread harm in the present, and how it evolves and transforms, particularly in the face of progress. And so the protests that we're seeing right now all over the world actually are a direct result of all of this. So when we see somebody like George Floyd, he becomes symbolic of the larger racial inequalities that we have in our society. So in other words, this is how we got to this actual moment. And I just want to do a breakdown. I've talked with several people, including Brandeis people, about this before, but I want to reiterate the ways in which, how we get to this moment of, I think we've used chaos, this moment of regression, this moment of fragile something or another. And I think it comes in part and parcel in a lot of different ways. So just to give you an example, the economy historically has not worked for Black and brown people. It's left millions of people unemployed and underemployed, right? And we think about somebody like George Floyd, he's in Minneapolis looking for work when he's murdered. We also can think about the failures of the American healthcare system and the repeated health crises that disproportionately affect Black people. So we can see that we are in the midst of a pandemic. That makes it very, very clear, right? That disproportionately is killing not just African Americans, but also Latino Americans and indigenous Native populations, right? Devastating them. We also see somebody like George Floyd, who again has COVID-19 in his lungs when he's murdered. And I really like to emphasize that because I think it says something profound and that we should talk about, particularly as we're thinking about how George Floyd is killed by the state, but is also dying from, right, this disproportionate way in which the American healthcare system and affects crises in Black communities. We can also talk a lot, and I think this is particularly salient, coming from Heller and coming from a public policy perspective, about the historical and continuing failures of public policy, public officials, public institutions, public representations of the state in the lives of Black people, right? So the clearest example of this in the moment is George Floyd, but it's also Breonna Taylor, right? As we think, if you guys aren't familiar with the case, Breonna Taylor in Kentucky is killed while she is sleeping during a no-knock raid when police officers from Kentucky burst into her home. So I want us to think about that. And that's this last point about the historical and continuing failures of public policy, public officials, and public institutions is really important as we think about solutions moving forward and kind of concrete examples of what we can do. And so this is this larger reason why somebody like George Floyd becomes symbolic of a larger movement. His death picks up on a lot of these trends. And I want to make the point that, the reason that we're seeing this, we're seeing marching in the street for 7 straight weeks. We've seen over 1,000 protests across the globe, more than 20 million participants in these protests, making this the largest mass movement protest ever, right, in history. But one of the reasons that this is happening is because protest is making it clear that the state is essentially illegitimate, right? That the state does not have legitimacy in the lives of Black people, or historically has not had legitimacy in the lives of Black people. Now, again, we can push back on that. And I think Anita did a wonderful job of showing how the state actually does do protective measures, has protective measures in the lives of Black people when we talk about, say, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But at the same time, we have to see the ways in which the state actually functions in a harmful manner, right? By doing the, 2013 Shelby v. Holder, actually the gutting of, public protections that were meant to enforce and protect the lives of Black people and their right to vote. So I want to make that clearly, that Black protest makes the point that the state is illegitimate and historically has been illegitimate, and that the social contract that governs the lives of, that governs our lives as Americans has historically failed Black people and continues to fail them. So the safeguards that we envision when we think of American democracy have failed Black people. So I also want us to think about the ways in which Black protest in this respect also represents our best chance at a true democracy for all people, because it calls out the state's failings and highlights the ways in which the state has failed Black and brown people across these different disciplines and industries, et cetera, et cetera. And so I thought it was actually this has been really eloquently expressed by Fannie Lou Hamer. And this forum is actually organized around Fannie Lou Hamer's words of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. But I actually wanted to share a quote from her from a speech from 1964, wherein she's deeply critical of democracy, of American democracy, but at the same time hopeful of using political protest to push for a more just society, both as an analytical lens, but also as a concrete push for more change. So she says, not only do we need change in the state of Mississippi, but we need a change here in Harlem. And it's time for every American citizen to wake up, because the whole world is looking at this American society, and quit saying that we are free in America when we know we are not free. You're not free in Harlem, you're not free in Philadelphia, you're not free in Chicago. And when you get it all the way around it, some of the places in Mississippi, some of the places are just Mississippi in disguise, and we want change. So we can see this kind of sentiment, this idea of being critical of democracy and democratic institutions, but still hopeful of the way in which democracy and democratic protest and institutions can actually push for more just society. We see it with the NAACP, we see it with the Civil Rights Movement, we see it with the Black Power movement, the anti-apartheid movement, and of course, the movement for Black lives. So the last point I'll make before I turn it back over to Maria is that while we have all of this, and while we see chaos, while we're seeing regression, while we're seeing, incremental change faced with backlash, that kind of thing, we also have a blueprint. We already have a blueprint and a roadmap for where to go from here. And I'll give you two quick examples, because there are dozens of blueprints, actually probably hundreds of blueprints. The first is radical reconstruction, right? This intense, systematic, comprehensive system that is designed to reincorporate newly enslaved individuals into the American body politic as full citizens. So for more than 8 years, we actually have a system that is designed to reinvent the entire American system, whether it be legislatively, policy-wise, property and economics, every single aspect of society. When it fails after 8 years, it doesn't fail because it doesn't work. It fails because of a deliberate and conscientious effort and act to dismantle it, right? So I want us to think about that kind of comprehensive structural change when we're thinking about blueprints for, structural inequalities and inequities. The second thing is the 1968 Kerner Commission report, right? The National Report on Disorder in America that comes out in 1968. You feel free to check it out. It's a 600-page document, but it provides dozens, if not dozens, hundreds of solutions to America's problems that are deeply invested in similar ideas to that we see under radical reconstruction. Out of all of that, the only programs that we see in solutions enacted from the Kerner Commission are the ones that come out in the 1968 Fair Housing Bill, right? And that's just around fair housing, but also the ones that increase power of the American police force. So it actually undermines the very thing that it says that it wants to change, right? In ending systemic racism and ending white supremacy, ends up actually reinforcing it. So we have the blueprints, we have roadmaps, we have chosen not to enact those ideas. So I want us to really think, in order to move forward, in order to think concretely about this, we actually should go back and revisit these larger histories in order to start thinking about structural big solutions to change in our country. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Maria.
All three of your presentations are so powerful, and I have a million questions. I'd like to probe just a couple of the answers and discussions we've just had before we go into our last question. But before I do that, I want to see if you have any questions of each other related to your descriptions from a perspective of an economist, historian, legal perspective on where we are and how we got here before we move to clarifying where to go.
I think I have a question for both Anita and for Bill. And I'd be interested in hearing your interpretation of the recent debates around reparations. Particularly reparations, and it's reemerged not simply as reparations in terms of like cash payments for descendants of, formerly enslaved individuals, but now it's come about in relationship to all of these conversations around policing and police inequity and things like that. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Anita, you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I'm actually, it's interesting that the first, I think, scholar that I know of who wrote about reparations, I think it came out in something like the 70s, was a guy named Boris Bitker, who was actually a tax professor. And I just say that to say that this is a conversation that's been out there for a while, and it always comes down to this to the same thing. One, how are we going to determine what the reparations should be? I mean, they come down to very technical ideas about how will we determine the money and who should get it, and who should get what. And there have been some different ideas about how we determine it. Maybe we base it on discrimination in education. Maybe we base it on discrimination in housing. I mean, where I think we really need to focus this conversation at this moment is a sort of bigger conversation about why it is owed. Why are reparations owed? What, in fact, has happened to the descendants of slaves in this country that entitles them? And that's what happens. That's where the conversations go. To some reparations, something from the government. And what are the elements that have to be established to show that entitlement? And the different models that we have really are about outlining what the government's role in creating the harm has been. We've got an example that I think we can grow on in reparations for the Greenwood community in Tulsa. Basically, there is proof of direct local government involvement in what happened in the massacre of a Black community in Tulsa. We have evidence that of direct harm and indirect harm, economically, physical harm. It's much easier for people to get their brains around that. Nevertheless, we have been having that conversation now for about almost 20 years, and we haven't been able to move forward. And I think what's holding people back is this real sense that there has been an ongoing harm since slavery in this country, and that we can make the case for that. Until then, I just think the reparations question will continue to be one of those theoretical discussions that we have until we understand that the harm actually has been and continues to be tied to the act of slavery, which was sanctioned by the government, the federal government, And those harms have been ongoing and continue today, and have been intergenerational. And at this moment where we are regressing, the impact is even greater now than they had been in some other times. I don't think we're going to make any progress. I mean, I'm hopeful about a lot of things, but I'm not hopeful about the question of reparations. Not that I don't think it should happen, but I think we are a long way from it actually occurring.
Yeah, I have a colleague, Richard America. He's retired from Georgetown, but he had been writing on reparations and had generated some estimates, and obviously on a variety of assumptions. In his work, I believe, I remember seeing it, reading it when I came out of grad school in the early 90s, but he had been at work at this for a long time. Tom Shapiro had just put in the chat, he's mentioning colleague of mine, Sandy Darity, and Kirsten Mullen. They have some new, probably would be the most recent work on reparations from an economist perspective. I think I was over the weekend at around 1 a.m. I was having a conversation about this with some friends and my son, one of my sons. So this is rather fresh on my mind here. I would want to expand. I mean, I think you probably have to do it in chunks, and so there's the government harm, but there's also and people have been using the word privilege, right? That there's been harm by the government, but at the same time, those government policies can and have provided opportunity for whites, right, or for non-blacks. And so at some point that also has to be, I think, in the calculation or in the analysis, right? Is okay, well, if you could think of a track meet, you have the 100-meter dash, right? In the perfect world, you would want to put everybody starting at the same point on the track. But what slavery did, and then the public policies, and then which promote certain types of investments, would promote a tax structure that allows that provides privilege to really get turned over multiple times, over and over and over, right? That then puts certain people, let's say, 50 yards down the track when the gun goes off. So I guess I'm more hopeful that we will see some type of reparation, even in our lifetime. And the reason I feel for that is, and it may not necessarily be a check that's written out to an individual, but it may be something as what we use forfeiture funds. Right? These are funds that are collected when someone via a crime. That those funds go back into Black communities, or they go to education, but with the goal of improving wealth, right? Because at one level, what slavery did, and the subsequent decades and years, right, that it's helped to create these massive wealth differences. And then, as my colleague Bill Spriggs, who's the chief economist for the AFL-CIO and at Howard University, he talks about in terms of what's a non-racist, anti-racist policy. It would be around focusing on wealth, right? And so the reparations could be in the form of helping Blacks, generate and catch up with acquiring wealth, because as Chris Rock, and I to sort of lower the level of conversation here, but Chris Rock, he has this wonderful segment where he talks about the difference between what it means to be rich and what it means to be wealth, and it's a good economics 101 treatise of this. And so Leah, to your question, I think it's I'm more hopeful also because of what you said too. And when you look at who's out protesting, it's a much more diverse group. That video of Chauvin and the two other cops, right, pinning Mr. Floyd down, right, that really has resonated with many more people, and especially my children, that young adult generation. It really has galvanized them. But I say to them, though, if you want to see reparations, if you want to see major change, you have to think about this as a marathon and not a sprint.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just make a couple of comments? First of all, when I talk about government action, I'm not just talking about direct government action. I'm talking about government action that enabled certain people, white people, to develop wealth and to gain wealth. So I'm not just talking about the act of slavery itself. I'm thinking about a whole years. The other thing that I wanted to mention.
But if I can jump in, I guess what I was, maybe to clarify my point, I think you have, and partly because of the challenge with public budgets, but you're also going to have to really hold private sector accountable. That there's going to have to be, there's going to have to be some reparations, so to speak, and from private sector.
That's what, that's exactly what I was trying to say, that it's, some people have been able to accumulate wealth because of government actions that privilege them.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to, it's not just the government that needs to be accountable for that wealth, it's the private sector individuals or companies as well. Mm-hmm. And that's, we've had reparations in other instances based on that model. The one thing I would say, and I know, Leah, that you had mentioned that the 65 Act was an act by the government, but it was also an act that came about because of protests. Mm-hmm. The 65 Act would never have happened had there not been massive protests. Mm-hmm. They were not as massive as what we have today, but it existed, not because the government wanted it to happen and never, they just came on it on their own. It didn't come from the head of Lyndon Johnson. Mm. It came from the heads of people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin Luther King. So that, I think, is something that we want to keep in mind. It was put in place, I would say. It helped to take some of the racism out of the system, our voting system in this country. But it wasn't necessarily there because the government realized that racism all of a sudden was there and they wanted to do something about it. So we could, in fact, to your point, see some real direct movement of the government. I think it'll have to start with an election if we want something meaningful. But and I think there are ways that we need to think about the election coming up in order to make that happen. But I also want to hear what you think, knowing what you know about protests, what do you think this moment of protest and disruption does to contribute to our getting to a point where I can be hopeful about reparation?
So that's a fantastic question. And it's also one I've been thinking a lot about because, even as all of this stuff is happening, I've been weirdly optimistic about the idea of kind of fragile transformative change coming out of this moment. And I completely agree with you, Anita, that I think, one of the things that I think is really important here is having a multiracial conversation about what has happened in this country. And I think we are finally at a cusp, we're finally at a moment where we can begin to have those conversations, right? 10 years ago, or even, 12 years ago, 20 years ago, but, prior to Barack Obama, we couldn't have those conversations. We were still struggling with the idea of, even apologizing as a country for the act of slavery. And yet, in a 7-week period, more than 70% of Americans have switched their opinion about the idea of Black Lives Matter, right? Like 2/3 of Americans now say that, systemic racism and racism is a real problem in America. So that signifies to me that there's an opportunity to do something. And that's what protest has been really important at doing, at pushing this conversation forward. So we're beginning to hear a lot about truth and reconciliation commissions or truth and reconciliation kind of, conversations. And while I think that's all well and good, I think it's nothing without teeth. And so what protesters have the ability to do right now, particularly as they continue to put, pressure on state and local actions, right? Not just the national, the state and local is actually really important here, is to drive the conversation forward while also pointing out this larger history. So it's both the continuing inequality, right? That systematized racism that you pointed out, but it's also highlighting this longer history of grievances, wrongs, right, compounded harms that have happened. And that's what the protesters have been so good at pointing out. And I'll just say in my own, just my own anecdotal evidence, I've been, teaching about past grievances and harms and the roles in which protest and federal government has worked for years now. And there has never been the level of interest in this kind of work up until the last 2 months. Right now, quite literally, everyone wants to talk about it. So I think we're at a cusp of having the conversation. The protests are driving that. It's the real question is, can the protests continue to drive that kind of conversation, which will ultimately lead to some aspect of concrete change? I don't know the answer to that last point.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot to digest in this conversation and a million questions popping into our minds, but also in our Q&A as well as the chat room. Before we go to those questions, I want to just ask each of you again to crystallize what you would recommend as things that either we can do personally or societally in addition to voting, or if you want to just reemphasize that voting is the answer, that would be great. And I'm making this plea because even though this seems like a moment that we visited before through past movements and past numerous civil rights acts, there are questions about whether all those Black Lives Matter signs we're seeing in the suburbs are performative or not. People want to know what's the teeth. And not only that, people want to know how can we reduce the backlash? Just like through Reconstruction, that's when the KKK was formed. Throughout history, it seems like one step forward, and Du Bois even says this: the slave goes free, stands a moment in the sun, and then is thrown back into slavery. People don't know history. People know slavery, and then they see today and wonder why Black people aren't doing better. So we need to teach history, and as a part of that, we need to explain about the backlash, and that I don't think we can see progress without explaining that with this protest, with these suggestions on steps to move forward, there's a lot of push and efforts to hold Blacks back. Sometimes it's violent, sometimes it's not. So if you could just give some suggestions on clear, concise suggestions on ways to move forward that might even require interpersonal truth and reconciliation, reflection, and education. Just your final suggestions. And then we'll go to the Q&A questions. We have 4 in the Q&A. So we'll go back and start with you, Professor Hill, if that's all right. You're on mute. Sorry, mute.
Yeah, let me fix that. So I do want to be clear. I do think we need to vote, but I do think what is more important than just the idea that we need to go out and exercise our right to vote is that we once again must restore the idea that our vote is important, that it is an important part of our democracy, and that this resistance to our vote is something that endangers our democracy. That the kind of suppressive acts that have been going on since Shelby versus Holder have been not only an injury to our communities, but also the very idea of this United States as a democracy. So it's more than the act of voting. It is really more than protecting the idea that we should be voting, that we are entitled to voting, because that I think is what is under attack. I think it's under attack directly and indirectly through neglect. And so I think it's an important moment, but what we have now really are these agents who have devised all of this way to take advantage of what seems to be a public, or it seems to have for years, be a public sentiment that our vote wasn't important and it could be taken away from us without much public outcry. So that's one of the things that I want to say. Now, the other thing that I want to say is that we also have to be very smart and very intentional about what we're going to be doing in order to elevate the idea of the significance of our right to vote. And that is that we've got to think about what happened in the midterm election when I think it was about 53,000 voters, 70% of them Black, were suspended from voting because they had misspelled names or didn't have hyphens right, or things that were so minor. We've got to think intentionally about who is the Black electorate, who is the population, what are the things that are keeping us from voting, even if we have the right to vote. What are the technological disparities that are in place that are preventing us from exercising the franchise? What are the conditions at work? The fact that some people cannot get off from work to go vote. What are the social and cultural factors that are keeping us? What now in this moment of COVID, what are the health issues that might be preventing us? We've got to really kind of think about this as our part of our democracy, but what are these other elements that are keeping us from exercising our right in this democracy? And I don't know that we are doing enough of that. I think we are just saying, let's tell people to go vote, and we're not thinking as strategically and tactically even in terms of the way that the anti-voting people have been thinking. And so I think we need to do more than even register people to vote. We need to be more thoughtful about what the impediments are, even when people are registered. And that would include age and technology and location, geography, all of those things that we will make an exercise of the franchise right to vote possible.
Excellent. Great. Those are marching orders for us to also find out what the barriers are to mail-in votes. Thank you,
Right.
Mr. Hill. How about Professor Wright Rigueur?
Sure. So, in terms of, what I suggest people can do concretely, I categorize them into two different areas. The first is long-term. And the first, what that means is this is a long-term march towards justice. This is a long-term investment. And so the most important thing that you can do is understand that this isn't a 1-year commitment. It's not a 2-year commitment. It's not a 5-year. It's not a 10-year. It's not a 20-year. It's a lifetime commitment. And so really coming to terms with the idea that this is something that you have to be committed to if you want to see change. It took us centuries to get here. It's going to take a long time to dismantle it. This is not a quick project. And in fact, a lot of the protest movements that we can look back on and say, well, these protest movements were successful, right? Successful, actually were long-term projects that invested years, if not decades, into transforming systems, inequalities, and moving us towards a more democratic nation. In the short term, though, there are these things that I call actionable items. And so I think there are 3 really big actionable items that I like to tell people that they can do, right? So they can say, all right, I woke up this morning and I contributed. The first one is set concrete goals, and that would be anything from voting, protesting, contributing time or resources, volunteering, advocating. But the important thing is that you contribute to this larger movement that is happening right now, because it's really people on the ground, grassroots people, volunteers, individuals that actually make a change. And I want to highlight two individuals who are part of these larger group movements for Black lives that are doing really important work. And it's this kind of, support for these kind of movements that actually is going to make a difference. So the first one is Nese Ofo, who's of the New Georgia Voter Project. Most people know and associate it with Stacey Abrams, but UFO is actually quite adept and is really the leader of the project. And the other one is Latasha Brown of Black Voters Matter, who's been doing really, really incredible and important work in terms of advocacy, in terms of, fighting back against voter suppression, voter depression, right? Engaging turnout and really thinking about these ways in really new and exciting parameters that I really fundamentally think are going to change this country in the long term. The second thing that I encourage people to do is to educate and enrich themselves. And so what does that mean? Yes, it means things like going to webinars or having your classes attend webinars or showing them things like that. Reading books, all of these reading lists that have come out. But it also means listening to the people who have been doing this work for, some people for generations, some people for years, but who have really invested their lives into studying these matters. And then the second part of that is not just educating and enriching yourself or even other people, but expanding your idea of what is possible. So a lot of times, right, some of the work that we come up against is because people just don't have the imagination or the vision to say these things are possible, right? I'll give you just an example for reparations. Most people originally, when we talked about reparations, they said, well, it's something that couldn't happen. Or when you said something like you reimagining policing, they said, well, you can't reimagine policing. It just is the way it is. And yet in the past 7 weeks, we've seen that it is totally possible to reimagine these things, and that people have been doing this for generations. And then in some areas, they've been very successful. So I want us to, part of what I encourage people to do is, even as you struggle with maybe concepts and ideas, I want you to at least expand your imagination and your creativity for what is possible, what you think is possible. And then the last thing is to look internally. So what is your organization doing in terms of concrete actions? Right? But also, what has your organization done in terms of past harms, right? So these nice symbolic gestures that we see, like blackout squares on Tuesday saying, we're going to make this donation to this organization or something like that. We stand against systemic racism. Those things are nice. But what's actually nicer is to look at internally within your own numbers. So if you're a private corporation, what does your C-suite look like? What does your, executive council, what does your board of trustees look like? What are your employees saying, right? Black employees right now are not okay. And they are being very vocal about the fact that they are not okay. So I think this also applies to institutions like Brandeis, where there have been a lot of statements too about, this is what Brandeis needs to do in order to change. And I say that is one of the easiest things, even though it may be difficult, the path forward would be difficult, but it's one of the easiest things for people to do immediately, to jump into those conversations as a way of moving the broader conversation forward in concrete ways.
Brilliant, thank you. Two extraordinary sets of marching orders. And it just reminds me as well, of the clarion call that racism is a public health crisis. And yet the petition coming out today is about the racism within one of our most esteemed institutions to protect our public health, the CDC. So we have a lot of work to do. Professor Rodgers?
Sure. So yeah, thanks, Maria. So I think the way, there's several frameworks we can come at this. I think the first way, the framework I would want people to think about is the 3 R's. And the 3 R's, they actually were applied during the Great Depression. It's relief, recovery, and then, but the third one, we are now here in New Jersey and other places, we're talking about reimagining, right? So it's relief, recovery, and reimagining the economy. Why is this important? Well, prior to the pandemic, economic insecurity has grown to its largest sort of levels on record. So yes, we have this wonderful economic expansion, but because we've weakened the social safety nets, we've weakened the role of institutions that help to improve worker share or employee share. We put more risk on families, on communities. And so when this pandemic occurred, it was no surprise as to why states' unemployment insurance systems were not able to meet the needs, because we had been disinvesting in government. We had been disinvesting in the public sector, in public sector workers. There was no surprise that the unemployment insurance was not able to handle it. There's no surprise that our hospitals and our public health systems, right, we're not able to respond accordingly. So from the standpoint of relief, what can people do at the local level and up to your state and federal level? You need to be a part of conversations that where people are talking about and putting the money behind their mouths with regards to wanting to have an inclusive recovery, right? Getting those resources, those PPE in those harder hit communities or in those harder hit neighborhoods, getting those resources there, making sure that small businesses, particularly minority-owned businesses, have access to those resources, the PPE, along with getting training and getting assistance on, well, how do I sanitize my workplace? Because if we don't get this virus under control as best we can, we're going to have a weaker recovery, and that recovery is not going to be as inclusive, which will then continue to cause expansion in income inequality, or pick your measure to occur. Another example of where you can be involved, and this isn't voting, this is just lobbying your leadership, or from an academic standpoint, public academic, writing your op-eds. I know there's countless numbers of dear colleague letters that are going around asking economists and others to sign those. Be active in those, right? Because if we don't, if, for example, what's going to happen at the end of this month, the $600 pandemic check that families have been getting per month who are unemployed, that's scheduled to go away. The Congress, the House has passed the HEROES Act, has a lot of good things in it that would help to continue to provide that bridge to recovery. But the administration and the Senate on the Republican side have been very slow to want to have a conversation about what we should do. And the other, so that's 1.1. Point number 2 in terms of that slow conversation is the real big concern about state and local budgets, right? That state and local budgets, state and local communities, those entities cannot they cannot print money, right? Like the Federal Reserve we can do it at the federal level. They are not in a position to push the political courage to raise taxes. So at the end of the day, if they're not able to fill those budgetary gaps that have emerged in the ending of this current fiscal year and going on into this next fiscal year, you're going to see another set of essential workers. They're going to lose their jobs. They're going to be laid off or furloughed, and those are state and local government workers such as firefighters, teachers, and now we're actually trying to get geared back up to bring kids back into the schools. So if those schools have to lay off teachers, I mean, it's a recipe for major problems. So those are some immediate conversations that you need to be a part of. And then third, on the reimagining of the economy. Right? This is where you can then really get into the conversations of, okay, how do we put together a new scaffolding? How do we put together a new structure, a new infrastructure in our economy? And the efforts there, I would say, and piggybacking up on what Leah said, yes, it's about having a decision table that looks like America, or it's about and what that means is we are seeing a major shift, right? A browning of America here in New Jersey. Our two sitting senators are men of color. At Rutgers, I haven't taught a white majority class in over a decade, right? And I'm teaching economics, right? So number one, it's about making sure that Blacks and others, right, are at that decision table, and they're at the adult table, not the kiddie table where there's decision, but at the adult table. Transparency is another big important thing. And there's back on the representation at the table, right? There's ample evidence, right? That's continues to come forward about the diverse committees, diverse organizations, right? You get a better outcome, right? Than if you're just quite homogeneous. Another major point, and this is this notion of doing that 360 internal conversation, right? Is looking at how you make decisions. And so such an example on admissions, have a colleague, he noticed that all of the kids from the HBCUs who were 4.0s, they were always at the bottom of their admissions list, right, or their offer list. And he dug into it, and he found that they were using an index on the school that they came from, which was a level or a ranking that was of being less competitive. Well, when they generated that index, right, all the Black kids and minority kids, Latino kids were at the bottom. But here's the problem, right? No one asked why, right? No one asked why. It's like that what cop who was watching Chauvin put the knee on Floyd's leg, right? No one said, well, these kids have 4.0s. They've got good internships, but all the Black kids are clustering at the bottom. So this moment has, I believe, gotten us to a point where people will be able to ask that question, right? Or to have the awareness, right? Oh, we need to, that maybe how we're making decisions is problematic. It is biased. And then the final thing I'll just say, and it's related to voting, but yes, there's going to be opportunities to vote, but that Ruth Bader Ginsburg will retire soon, right? And we will have, and we as a nation, right, people, Blacks or Latinos, women, right, are going to need to be in that conversation, right, and lobbying and putting pressure. There'll be a new Fed chairman at some point, just as important as that new Supreme Court opening, right? So there's ample opportunity, and then at the local level with your school boards, right, being engaged there, and making sure that those organizations not only will provide will provide some crumbs, but it's got to be the whole pie, the structure, right? And that's in the particular part of that really is that sort of fearless inventory of how you operate.
Thank you. 3 brilliant sets of recommended specific actionable items that we can help move forward. We have 14 questions in the Q&A. I am going to just ask a couple of them, but what we'll also do is to type these up and submit them to our panelists afterwards so that we can then hopefully share these responses, the questions and the answers, with all attendees. But at a minimum, we will give direct responses to those who submitted the question by name. One question came in from Jeff Goulding's. What role do religious communities of faith, such as churches, synagogues, and mosques, in driving the legal and economic changes necessary to roll back systemic racism in the institutions of our country? What role do the religious institutions play in helping move the initiatives that you've described forward?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that. I mean, they're very important. And one example that we're doing here in New Jersey, and I helped to sort of generate the idea, is that we, on our Restart and Reopening Committee, we have a variety of partners, and particularly the CEO, private sector CEO council was created to help the governor with resources to workplaces. But what we're actually doing right now in the process, we're creating a third sector CEO council or executive director council, which would be made up of people from United Way, but also from religious organizations, and in particular because they're on Main Street, right? They really are on Main Street, and so from a standpoint of really making sure we are creating an inclusive recovery, right? That's where we can directly go and we can find how we're doing. And the other thing, I'll go back on the earlier question I wanted to ask too, is we have to collect the data by race, right? And so that's also related to, right, expanding who's at the table too.
I would just say religious institutions really need to play a role that they have played in the past. One is to be a sanctuary for people who are hurt, and to do the kind of charitable work that they have done to reach out to communities. But I think in this day where we're talking about we need more conversations, they need to be a host to these conversations. They need to help organize, to structure them, to bring people in. They can reach out to community members in ways that other institutions cannot do, to provide safe places, if you will, for these kinds of conversations to take place, and to be actively engaged in the conversations themselves. And unfortunately, they also need to do some self-examination. To really understand the role that they have played in the furthering of the kind of behaviors that are now being protested against.
Thank you. Leah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll just jump in and say, I want to echo that and say that historically Black churches and Black church spaces have been sites of protest and political organization and progressive advancement. So that should be no different in the present, although I completely agree with Anita, there are a lot of Black churches that need to do some soul searching and think about the ways that they have actually replicated harm in areas that are critical to democracy. But I did want to give one concrete example, which is Reverend Barber's Moral Mondays movement,
Right.
which is enormously successful in organizing and mobilizing Black people in the United States, but also multiracial movements. And so most recently in June, I think had an event, both a virtual and in-person masked event that generated over close to 2 million participants. And so that's the kind of thing that, these various movements, these various protests, even political movements need to really think about harnessing right now. So how can we get that energy? It's Ella Baker who says, I have a problem with the church, right? Patriarchy because of charismatic leadership, but I also understand the real organizing and mobilizing potential of the church as a site of transformative change. And so that's what I would encourage people to think about.
Thank you. Thank you all. Do you want one more question, or should we sign out? We only have 2 more minutes before we're at the top of the hour.
You can do one more question.
Okay, this one is the one we're going out on. I am white. My mother utterly rejects the idea of systemic institutional racism. She has counterfacts to what is presented to her to attempt to have or see, understand otherwise. Given that the data supporting this type of racism is clear, what resources might be helpful for me to help encourage more of a heart or emotional change?
That's not a quick answer question.
But you put us out there. You said bring it on.
I didn't know it was going to be that question. But it is, it's an important question. I know in the election of 2008 that a lot of people were convinced. In fact, Charles Ogletree did a presentation around about the 2008 election in some of his canvassing that he did. And what he found was that a lot of older whites who didn't really get why we needed a Black president, and why shouldn't we just continue as they had been, were being influenced by their children, by their grandchildren, to get out and vote and to vote for Barack Obama. And I think it's not something that happens instantly. None of this does. But I think that knowing, a person, knowing what things that they value, gives you an entree into talking about race as a value, and anti-racism as a value. And I would need to know more exactly what the relationship is like and what moves your mother in order to be able to give you specific advice about that. But I think it's just going to take a lot of interpersonal and conversations where you go really to the heart of who your mother is and who you are and where you connect in order to be able to move the needle on that. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden she's going to start, donning a Black Lives Matter t-shirt and going out to protest. But it does mean that it can change things incrementally and slowly.
Yeah. if I would say two things to this person. Number one is, if you appeal to her experiences throughout life as a woman, that being a person of color, being a woman, right? It's very hard to go through your life without, and regardless of whether you get a PhD, law degree, become a CEO, right? But if you are Black or a woman, right, at some point in time, or continuation of time of experiences, race and gender is going to smack you on the head. And so one entry point may be a conversation around with her around her experiences as a woman, and then if she is able to go there and expresses that, yeah, I had a supervisor who treated me unfairly. Well, that might be the way you usher in that conversation. The other thing I would say is here in New Jersey, and we've gone national with our United Way, where I volunteer on the board. We created this concept called ALICE, where ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. And basically, it's our 38% of our households here in the state that do not have enough resources to make ends meet, to cover their housing, to cover their education, to cover their child care, and other expenses. And one of the things that we did to help engage people, to help raise their awareness, we took each budget item of Alice and said, okay, what does it mean for Alice if she doesn't have good housing? What does it mean for Alice if she doesn't have funds for education for her children, or access to childcare, good childcare? But we went one step further, a big step further, and we added in a column in this table that says, what does it mean for everybody in our community, right? If Alice doesn't have a good home, if Alice doesn't have access to childcare. And so we've used that tool as a way to try to engage, and a way to try to awaken people to become more sympathetic to seeing that, wow, yes, I can see that, yeah, they have a problem, but their problem is my problem, right? That if we're going to move this conversation forward, and really address racism in all forms, right, we have to get people in that second column of, yes, they may get up and go through their daily lives and not be adversely impacted, and actually have experienced privilege. And we don't want to make them feel guilty for that privilege. Maybe some people do, but I don't think that's the effective approach, like particularly with this mom. But get her to start to see that, and hopefully end up, the best of all worlds, becoming an advocate, right, for kids or for young people who, let's say, don't live in our neighborhood, but they those kids who we saw at the beginning of the documentary, right? That those Black kids don't live in that neighborhood, but people in that neighborhood have to really realize that their economic security today and into the long run depends upon the economic security of their neighbors, whether they're Black or white, male, female, Asian, Latino, right? That we all are integrated, we all are tied together as one. And and we're as strong as our weakest link. And our final comment would be, is my old boss, Secretary Alexis Herman, used to say, right, we've got a lot of hard work to do if we want to make the promise of America, right, the practice of America.
Thank you, Leah.
Yeah, so I'll just say two quick things because I know we're out of time. But the first is that there's a lot of work done by, in particular, social psychologists on how do you convince, essentially white people who are resistant to the ideas about anti-racism, racism, systemic racism, how do you get them to change their hearts and minds? And there's one school of thought, and I think there's again, a lot of research on this. Jennifer Richardson at Yale University is a pioneer in this, that says, well, actually, we shouldn't be focusing on changing people's hearts and minds, because hearts and minds can change one direction, right? They can become, okay, I'm down with the movement, but it can just as easily move back, right? So they can flip their opinions. And it actually, over time, it shows they go back and forth and back and forth. But then instead, what we should do is incentivize them. and that there are lots of different ways to incentivize people to care about, you know, anti-racist or, you know, Black progressive politics and policies, in part by showing how it affects them, right? Particularly because we're in an individualistic community, and without knowing, you know, the values of your, say, somebody like your mother, there's a way in which you can tie it to her experience as a way of incentivizing her to care about these things, even though it may not change her heart or mind. The second area, and I think this is one where we can actually do a lot of good, particularly at a university, is that studies have shown if you simply confront someone with all of this new information, right? You bring this to your mother, you say, here are books, here are resources, here's a TV program, that person will actually double down on their pre-existing beliefs. So it'll actually make it worse. It doesn't matter how much you show. It actually, you know, is like, it's too much, and it ends up making them see something else. What actually works really, really well is walking someone through the process in a classroom situation, much like what we do at Brandeis, where there's a lot of hand-holding and there's a lot of safe spaces to be wrong. And it's that exposure, right? There's a meme floating around that says, I don't have the ability to indoctrinate my students. It's actually the experience of going to college and going to university or going to spaces where people have diverse experiences, different perspectives, right? To come from different racial backgrounds that forces them to really think in different ways. So my proposal is actually, we need to take those experiences that we give to students and professionals and graduate students and higher education, and we need to bring them out into the wider world and try and replicate that space, because that's where real change happens.
Thank you so much, each of you. This has been enlightening, exceptional, and we should have a whole week-long discussion on each of these topics, as well as each of the questions submitted by the participants. Thank you to all the participants for your wonderful, attentive participation, as well as submitting questions. Thank you again, and I wish you great continued strength, courage, and wisdom, and I hope to see you again in a similar conversation soon. Thank you, everyone.